In my Should You Pull video, I did add some semblance of a guide for Hu Tao, and since her banner should be up by the time this video comes out, I may as well make a comprehensive guide for her. Hello everyone and welcome back to another video, and this time around we'll go over a comprehensive guide over our resident prankster Hu Tao. Now let's start off with her kit. So for her auto attack is really nothing special, a simple 6-hit combo of the Polearm type, so there's nothing special to really see here. Thus, let us move on to the elemental skill. Her elemental skill drains 30% of Hu Tao's current HP and provides an attack buff based on her max HP. It also gives her Polearm a Pyro infusion which cannot be overridden and gives her resistance to interruption. Her charge attacks apply the Blood Blossom effect on the enemy, of which triggers every 4 seconds as long as the Pyro infusion is still up, and the Blood Blossom is considered elemental skill damage and this does Pyro damage. With her elemental burst, Hu Tao grabs a spirit and swings it around her, dealing huge AoE Pyro damage. The damage scales off her attack, and it also heals her based on her max HP and how many enemies hit, with a maximum of 5. If Hu Tao is below 50% HP, both the damage and the healing will be increased. Now, Hu Tao's Ascension 1 gives a 12% crit rate buff to the team except Hu Tao herself whenever the infusion from her elemental skill ends. This is in general a very nice passive to allow your teammates to crit more often after the first rotation ends. It's also pretty good because it actually helps your teammates, especially your supports, to trigger the Favonia's passive more reliably. Hu Tao's Ascension 4 gives 33% pyro damage bonus if she has 50% HP or less. This works in tandem with the HP drain mechanic from her skill since it drains her HP enough that you can take advantage of the passive. Though this can only really work from the second rotation onwards, since her HP won't fall below 50% during the first rotation unless you intentionally take damage. And depending on the situation, unless you're running a shielder like Zhongli, it may be quite difficult for Hu Tao to survive if you have to go with that much HP. For talent priorities, generally you want to level up her autos over her elemental skill, at least at the same level over the elemental burst. Though it is worth noting that all of her talents do contribute a good amount of damage, so you don't really want to leave them at a low level. And since her skill does indeed scale off HP, it is ideal to bring her to level 90 if you want her to do as much damage as possible. Now that that is out of the way, let us move on to the Constellations. So Constellation 1 makes her charge attack not consume stamina at all if she is in the infused state from the elemental skill. Out of all constellations, this is probably the best one for how easy it is to manage your stamina, and also it feels really good and comfortable to do more charge attacks compared to C0. If you're running her optimal combos such as N1CD, it allows her to do a few more charge attacks which results in an overall damage increase. Constellation 2 increases her Blood Blossom damage based on Hu Tao's maximum HP, and her burst will also apply the Blood Blossom effect on the enemies. This is a very minor constellation since her Blood Blossom isn't really her main source of damage, but I guess it's better than nothing. Constellation 3 increases her skill level by 3 levels, which is kind of a decent upgrade. Constellation 4 is a very situational constellation since it buffs the team's crit rate by 12% only if you defeat an enemy who has the Blood Blossom effect. If you can trigger this reliably, it is decent, but otherwise it's not very realistic, especially against single target enemies such as bosses. Constellation 5 increases her burst level by 3, which is kinda decent in burst nuke teams if you intend to run that. And Constellation 6 is the most interesting one. The effects trigger when Hu Tao's HP drops below 25% and when she suffers a lethal hit or when she is at 1 HP, of which for the next 10 seconds Hu Tao's crit rate is increased by 100% and all her resistance is increased by 200% with some interruption resist. As I've mentioned in the Should You Pull video, this constellation is mostly used for a burst nuke setup, especially done by the whales whose wallet is big enough to be able to afford it. Otherwise, it's not generally that impressive of a constellation when you consider how it is a Constellation 6 and you compare it to a lot of the C6 for other 5-star characters. Now that that's done, let us move on to the combos. For Hu Tao's most optimal combos, we have multiple variants. So first we have N1C and N2C. And if you don't know what that means, N1C essentially refers to doing a single normal attack into a charge attack, thus N1C. And for N2C, as you may have guessed it, is essentially doing 2 normal attacks instead into a charge attack. So both of these combos have their own benefits. N1C is easier to perform, while N2C allows for a higher damage ceiling with less stamina consumption. It is also, I would argue, more comfortable to do. So to complete the chain, there are 2 ways to do charge attack cancels. The first one being dashing, and the second one being jumping. So N1CD, which is the dash cancel variant, is the more common and popular version since it is very easy to use and pretty straightforward, although it does come with some downsides. The first being a huge stamina drain at C0, and the second being that the dash cooldown that will trigger after doing the first two N1Cs. So the dash cooldown thing generally can be bypassed by inserting a jump cancel every third combo. And keep in mind that this is the most popular combo only for Constellation 1 Hu Tao owners. If you are at C0, you can probably go for N1CJ, which is through the jump cancel. So N1CJ is the C0 jump cancel technique done by people who want to optimize their Hu Tao damage, of which it does take a while to get used to because it does need a little bit of skill on the user's end. I recommend checking on Keqing Main's Hu Tao guide as it does have some videos on how to do these combos reliably. I mean, freaking someone out there recorded themselves doing the freaking C0 Hu Tao jump cancel on mobile, so I do recommend checking out the link down below. You could also do the same charge attack cancel combos with the N2C version. So overall, all these combos, depending on which one you like, has their own fair share of ups and downs, like N2C having a higher damage ceiling and more comfortable, while N1C being more easy to use. But at the end of the day, just feel free to experiment and choose whichever combo you like, or maybe you just don't even want to bother with cancels and just spam away. That's perfectly fine. Now, let us move on to her weapon options. For weapons, her signature, the Staff of Homa, is her best in-slot weapon. Boasting a very high crit damage stat, the high base attack alongside with the passive not only makes it great for Hu Tao, but it can also be used on other polearm characters. Not only does the wielder gain more HP, they also gain more flat attack based on their maximum HP. Meanwhile, a close competitor to the Staff of Homa, unexpectedly, is Zaino's signature weapon, the Staff of the Scarlet Sands. So the high crit rate stat alongside with the passive makes the weapon strong enough to compete with Homa if Hu Tao is run with a high elemental mastery build. And given that Hu Tao has access to the Blood Blossom mechanic, it is possible to consistently at least gain 1 stack for the passive, and then if you're against multiple enemies, maybe 2 to 3 stacks to take advantage of the highest damage possible. And if you're not a Xiao owner, the Primordial Jade Wing Spear is pretty decent, although it is bested by some 4-star options. And given that you have to do a certain number of hits in order to stack up the passive on the Jade Spear, you probably want to go for N2Cs instead of N1Cs instead. Whilst untested, maybe it is, I'm not too sure, the calcs done by the Theory Crafters have brought us a new best 4-star polearm for Hu Tao, and that being the Ballad of the Fjords. So this new BP weapon is actually a pretty good option in teams outside of Mono Pyro or teams that is run with less than 3 elements. At Refinement 5, this could even compete with some of the 5-star options, although it does come at a cost, quite literally. Otherwise, the Dragon's Bane is well known to be her more, or if not the most accessible 4-star weapon, and the more refinements you have in this weapon, the stronger it performs. And if you don't have any of these other options, if you somehow have this weapon, the Lithic Spear that is available on the gacha is pretty good if you run her China #1 team, aka the Hu Tao Double Hydro with Yelan, Xingqiu and Zhongli, since the entire team is basically from Niwei. Other weapons can be used as well, although the performance will be inferior to the options we have just mentioned just now. And to be honest, at this point, if you really don't have any of these options, just run an R5 White Tassel unless for some reason you foddered it because you didn't know that there were 3-star weapons that were exclusive to the chest. Yeah, don't do that, just actually save it if you care. Anyways, let us move on to her artifacts. So for the main stats, the Sands you can either run HP or an Elemental Mastery Sands. There are a lot of things to consider since there is no general answer on which is better, since it is completely dependent on your overall stat and the weapon use. I'd recommend using what you have and test it out in the open field to see which one serves you better and possibly does more damage. Of course, for the goblet, you want to use a Pyro damage goblet and a crit circlet for whichever stat you are lacking. I personally recommend going for crit rate until maybe 70% crit rate, then you can probably focus on crit damage and other stats alongside of EM and such. So for substats, you want to go for Elemental Mastery till a breakpoint of roughly 100 to 150. After that, you can probably go for crit, and then once you're done with that, you can probably try to push your Elemental Mastery to 200 to 300 over other stats like HP percent or attack percent, then over everything else. Of course, this EM requirement does include the team buffs provided by characters like Sucrose or other things like the 4 Instructor set or the Elegy for the end. Overall, just try to have a decent amount of Elemental Mastery alongside going going for a good crit ratio of 1:2 with some elemental mastery to go along with it. And now for the sets. So the 4-piece Crimson Witch of Flames is a very good all-rounder set for Hu Tao since her entire kit can benefit from the effects. The only downside is that the domain is not very resin efficient compared to other options unless for some reason you want to farm the 4-piece Lava Walker for your mono Pyro characters. Otherwise, you also have the 4-piece Shimenawa Reminiscence because it provides a higher damage ceiling for Hu Tao's charge attack. However, it does come at a cost at bursting less due to the energy drain mechanic from the 4-piece effect. Depending on what team you run, this may serve to be an inconvenience, although ER rolls are very highly appreciated to consistently trigger the 4-piece effect for Hu Tao. Not to mention, the domain also has the emblem of Severed Fate, so it is very, if not it is the most resin efficient domain in the game right now. Otherwise, if you don't have any of these options, the 4-piece Gilded Dreams is an underrated choice, and while it doesn't perform that well as the previous options, that is completely dependent on how good your substats are. Without Elemental Mastery buff, the Gilded Dreams set is very competitive with the previous two sets, and you also gain the option to burst more often compared to running the 4-piece Shimenawa. Otherwise, if you don't have any of these other options, you could go for a mix of the 2-piece sets consisting of Elemental Mastery or HP or maybe Pyro damage from something like the Crimson Witch. This option is pretty decent if you have no other choice and you happen to have some pieces with really good substats lying around. You could also use the 2-piece Marehosi Haunter because it does buff normal and charge attacks by 15%. Now, let us move on to the teams. So for teams, most of our options involves the Vaporize reaction, which essentially has 3 different variants. Now let's start off with the first variant, the most popular one, the Double Hydro variant. So in this team, it is mandatory to have both Yelan and Xingqiu, with the 4th slot being a complete flex slot. Generally, you could either run Zhongli for comfort, survivability, and the resistance shred with the 4 tenacity artifact, or the 4 archaic Petra just to buff the hydro damage from both Yelan and Xingqiu, or you could also use Kazuha to increase the damage ceiling of the team, mostly just for Yelan and Xingqiu. This team also takes advantage of Yelan and Xingqiu's synergy with each other on how well they work, alongside with the HP buff from the Hydro Resonance. If for some reason you don't have Yelan or Xingqiu, or you just don't want to run them together for whatever reason, you can always settle with the regular Mono Hydro variant. So this version only runs either Yelan or Xingqiu, with the last 2 slots being very flexible. You could either slap on a Shielder for survivability, or you could run an Overvape variant with Fischl or any Electro unit. By the way, Overvape stands for Overload and Vaporize. Otherwise, you could also run a Melt variant with 2 Cryo characters, or you could run double Geo for Geo Resonance, assuming you have a Shielder character along with it, like Zhongli or Noelle. Meanwhile, the other stronger variant is the VV Vape version. So just to clarify, VV, when we use the term VV in the community, it refers to the Viridescent Veneer set, of which swirls on one of the 4 main elements will decrease their resistance based on what that element is. So this team either runs Yelan or Xingqiu with another Pyro and an Anemo unit holding the Viridescent Veneer set. While this team is much harder to play due to the rotations for double swirls, it does reward you by boosting the team's overall damage. For the Anemo slot, you can run either Kazuha or Sucrose. So Kazuha offers you the ability to swirl both Hydro and Pyro given the right setup, alongside the elemental damage buff from swirls. And the ability to swirl these 2 elements at the same time is what you call double swirl. On the other hand, Sucrose can offer an elemental mastery buff, which allows Hu Tao to do a higher reaction damage from her charge attacks. However, her rotation is a little bit more difficult to do if you intend to do double swirls compared to Kazuha. For the Pyro slot, you could either run Bennett for the attack buff and healing, or Toma for the interrupt resist plus the small shield with 4 damage reduction, or Amber for the Pyro application from her burst with some potential buffs depending on what weapon or artifact she has. So to explain, Bennett is pretty straightforward. He buffs attack and heals you if you have Constellation 1, and also the cleansing effect from the burst is pretty nice. While you could argue that you don't want Hu Tao to be healed due to the Ascension 4 and maybe the Staff of Homa, because it's difficult for you to trigger that passive, running Bennett can offset that with enough investment. Though personally, I would recommend just testing it out on the field and see which one you are more comfortable with and which one you prefer to run. Now moving on to the next Pyro unit, Toma is very much straightforward. He provides a small shield that can reduce damage, he provides interrupt resist to prevent your Hu Tao from getting staggered, and also gives a little bit of energy to Hu Tao if you're running Shimenawa. And also, if you have Constellation 6 Toma, he can buff Hu Tao's charge attack damage. Meanwhile, Amber's burst applies pyro fast enough that it is easy for you to consistently trigger the VV effect, and she can buff the team if you run things like the Elegy for the End for the buffing passive, the Favonius Warbow for more energy for the team, or you run things like Full Instructor to buff the team's Elemental Mastery, or Full Noblesse just to buff the team's attack. And she buffs even better if you do have her Constellation 6. And now lastly, we'll move on to the Mono Pyro team. So Mono Pyro is a very much self-explanatory team. You just want to run Hu Tao with 2 other Pyro characters, and you can just slap on a flex slot. Generally, people like to run an Anemo unit for the Viridescent Venerer effect. Her options are roughly the same as the previous variants, so you can run Pyro units like Bennett, Thoma, or Shengling, with the last slot being any Anemo unit using the Viridescent Venerer set. You could run Shielders as a last slot alternatively, like, Zhongli or Layla, or you could run certain Unorthodox unit. And speaking of Unorthodox, let us talk about some usual teammates for Hu Tao. So at Constellation 6, Candice is actually a surprising option because you can use her to activate the Hydro Resonance by being the second Hydro unit. And while her Hydro application is slow, it shouldn't really lose out on Hu Tao if you're running Yelan as the other Hydro character. For Shielders, we already mentioned Zhongli and Thoma, but other units like Layla, Diona, or Tank Fei aka HP Yan Fei at Constellation 4 can work pretty well. Generally in Tank Fei, you just want to run a decent amount of ER while running triple HP so that you can make Yan Fei's shield as strong as possible. The fact that she's Pyro, it allows her to do the Viridescent Venerer effect, and it makes it easier for you to set that Pyro buff up if you're running Kazuha, or maybe if you want to buff Elemental Mastery from someone like Sucrose. Of course, this does come at a cost because she does need a lot of energy recharge to be able to consistently trigger the shield. Personally, I have used Layla in the 3.7 Abyss because my Zhongli was reserved for the first half and they had to go against the Consecrated Beast, and we had the Iniquitous Baptist in the second half, and I eventually and somehow got 36 star thanks to that. On the other hand, Deya can be used because she does work in some teams since she provides interrupt resist, and that also kinda helps in allowing certain double swirl setups. Yunjin, on the other hand, can add to Hu Tao's damage if you're running the N2C variant instead of the N1C combo, since she can buff normal attack. An unusual choice, Albedo can contribute to the team's damage with his Flower, on top of the 125 Elemental Mastery buff from his Ascension 4. And lastly, maybe unusual, maybe not, but Nahida can offer the team a very big boost in Elemental Mastery, on top of having such a good elemental skill that you can allow the team to run Burgeon, which basically adds up to the overall damage. However, the only downside is that if you're running this team without a shielder, the Burgeons may just chuck down Hu Tao's health and possibly kill you. And the only other downside is that you are taking the best Dendro support away from running the other side of the Abyss. And so that does it for this comprehensive guide video. I hope you guys find this video helpful for your Hu Tao. Give it a like if you enjoyed the video and found this informative. Subscribe for more content, and leave a comment if you have any thoughts or feedback to share. I wish you the best of luck in your Hu Tao summons, and I'll see you guys in the next video. This is Ethereal, signing off.